This is the story of two serial killers. One of them, Dr. Harold Shipman, killed hundreds of people before he was caught.
Dr. Shipman was present immediately prior to death and administered an injection and was there at the time of death.
But lessons learnt investigating Shipman meant the second killer, nurse Colin Norris, was stopped in his tracks.
You were also injecting a patient with insulin.
No, I wasn't. You're sitting there saying, you suspect, you presume, you blah, blah, blah.
Both men preyed on people they'd been trusted to look after. But what was it that drove them to kill?
I'm convinced that if Colin Norris hadn't have been stopped in his tracks, then he would have developed into being a serial killer of immense proportions, because I'm convinced he enjoyed killing people.
West Yorkshire, once the killing ground of Britain's most notorious multiple murderer, Dr. Harold Shipman. In 2002, police discovered they had another serial killer on their hands. Once again, he belonged to the medical profession, and once again the victims were elderly patients. Leeds General Infirmary, part of the biggest teaching hospital in Europe, was where they met their deaths. Ward 36 is a general orthopaedic ward. Every year, hundreds of people are treated here for broken bones. 86-year-old Ethel Hall was a typical patient.
She was a hard-working family person that had a shop, milk round, so she was well known within the village and the community. People used to say she was quiet, but when somebody upset her, they knew they had done.
At the time of her admission, Ethel was living at home with her husband, John.
They'd been married over 50 years. They married shortly after my dad came out of the army after the Second World War. And from there, they've lived locally ever since. She fell and broke her hip, so they rushed her into Leeds for a hip repair, which should have been a straightforward operation.
5 days after the surgery, Stuart visited his mother in hospital.
Oh, she was recovering well. She'd been sat in the chair, done a little bit of walking, talking, you know, reasonably active. She just wanted to come home. She was ready for home. She'd been in there long enough, she said.
That evening, Ethel took some painkillers and settled down for what she and her family thought would be an uneventful night. Nursing staff checked on her several times over the next few hours and found no signs that anything was wrong. But then, at around 5 a.m, they heard her coughing. 2 nurses and a care assistant went to her bedside.
She was like struggling to breathe because there was a choking sound and she was unresponsive really. We sat her up because she was kind of slumped in the bed a bit. Usually if someone's struggling to breathe, you'd sit them up. The care assistant got the suction, which is something you'd use if someone has like saliva in the mouth. You'd suction them to get rid of it to help with the airway. And we did our observations with a blood pressure machine. We administered oxygen and I went and called the doctor then.
Doctors were baffled. A patient on the road to recovery had suddenly gone into a coma. They ordered a blood test and discovered that her blood sugar or glucose level was so low that her brain had shut down. This might be expected in a diabetic patient whose body can't control blood sugar, but Ethel Hall did not suffer from diabetes.
It was early one morning, early in the morning, and they rang and just said mother had taken a turn for the worst and could we go down? So I rang my father and went straight down. I think you're in shock and you don't know what to say. You just got to sit and watch.
After several hours, doctors did manage to get Ethel's blood sugar level back to normal, but by then, it was too late. Her brain was permanently damaged.
We went and had a talk to a doctor in a separate room, and she said that Mum had had a serious incident, but she didn't enlighten any further apart from those low blood sugars.
As medical inquiries continued, one member of staff developed a worrying theory.
I wonder whether she could somehow have been given an injection of insulin to cause the low blood sugar. It wasn't necessarily malicious. Patients are sometimes given the wrong medication, somebody else's medication. I mean, we just didn't know.
To determine whether Ethel had been injected with insulin, staff had to carry out special tests before the drug left her body. A full blood sample was ordered and senior hospital managers alerted.
If too much insulin had been injected, either that would have been done as an accident or would have been done as a purposeful act. So in either of those would be a very serious matter.
The blood samples were sent to a specialist testing centre in Surrey. There, Dr. Hall's suspicions were confirmed. Ethel had a huge amount of insulin in her system.
The insulin level was above 12,000 picomoles per litre. In a healthy individual, we wouldn't expect the insulin to be above 120 picomoles per litre. So the level in Mrs. Hall's sample was 100 times more than what we would normally expect.
That's a massive dose of insulin. And there's no way that MD would be taking anything like that. There are a few exceptional patients who have insulin resistance who need large doses, over 100 units maybe a day. But there is absolutely no conceivable way that you could overdose somebody with 1,000 units by chance or by accident.
The conclusion was alarming. Ethel Hall must have been deliberately attacked while in her hospital bed. The police were called in. And when Ethel died a few days later, their investigation became one of murder.
People die in hospital. Unfortunately, every day of the week people are dying, but they're not dying in these circumstances with a huge dose of pharmaceutical insulin in the system. That shouldn't happen, and so somebody has administered it. We've got to work out not only who's done it, but how's it happened.
Insulin is not considered to be a dangerous drug, and so legally it doesn't need to be locked up. On Ward 36, all the nurses had access to a fridge containing vials of insulin. Some had gone missing on the night Ethel Hall went into a coma. So police suspicion quickly fell on the staff who'd been caring for her that night. One person in particular stood out. But nurse Colin Norris had an answer for everything.
Obviously, if somebody was going to kill someone, they wouldn't leave their signature, would they?
What do you mean by that?
To say that they were there.
Murders are rare on hospital wards, but that's what police were investigating at Leeds General Infirmary in December 2002. 86-year-old patient Ethel Hall had been given a lethal dose of insulin, most probably by a member of the nursing staff.
I was very shocked to find out it was an intentional injection or an intentional attack on my mother. You don't expect that in hospital.
Suspicion fell on those working on Ward 36 the night Ethel Hall fell into a coma.
The great majority of our staff, the overwhelming majority of our staff, come to work in order to care for patients in one way or another. So to know that there's a possibility that a colleague has behaved in this way is devastating.
But for Chief Superintendent Chris Gregg, a detective with 30 years' experience, it was easier to believe.
I was aware that, there are at times criminals at work in every profession, not least the trusted world of the medical and nursing professions.
Chris Gregg's team quickly established that Ethel Hall's death was part of a pattern. In the previous 6 months, 2 other patients, Doris Ludlam and Bridget Burke, had also died unexpectedly after developing similar symptoms. But as both were elderly and suffering from a number of illnesses, neither death had caused suspicions at the time.
The hospital staff seemed to remember another couple of cases which had been not dissimilar to this. And so from the very start of the investigation, we thought we might not be dealing with an isolated incident here. There could be something serious and sinister happening.
The investigation team had few clues, but they were able to draw on invaluable experience. Just 18 months earlier, they'd conducted a detailed inquiry into the background of Britain's most notorious serial killer, Dr. Harold Shipman. On the 30th of April 2001, Detective Chief Superintendent Chris Gregg had ordered Shipman to be brought from prison. He'd already been convicted of murdering 15 patients, but was suspected of killing hundreds more. The police wanted to know exactly how many.
Right, this interview is being tape recorded. It may be given in evidence if your case is brought to trial.
This is the custody area at Halifax Police Station. This is where Harold Shipman was brought from prison the morning that we interviewed him.
Shipman's victims were all elderly, all injected with lethal doses of morphine. He killed the majority of them during his 20 years as a family doctor in Hyde, near Manchester. But it was as a young GP in Todmorden, West Yorkshire, that he'd first developed a taste for murder.
We wanted to bring Shipman here to Halifax, back into the patch where we suspected he started his killing spree. We needed to take him back in his memory to try and open him up, to get him talking about what happened here 25 years before.
The date is the 30th of April 2001 and the time is 16 minutes past 3 o'clock. We're in an interview room at Halifax Police Station.
Shipman was already serving a full life sentence. Nothing would be added by any new charges. But the police wanted to learn lessons from the past in case another figure like Shipman emerged in the future.
We know that Shipman certified 22 deaths in Todmorden, and from the work that we've done, we know that he was present or thereabouts of being present at 9 of those patients' deaths when they died. Now, that works out around 40% of occasions when he was present. Comparing that with 1% of the occasions when we know that GPs ordinarily are present at patients' deaths in their own home, it's a massive difference. And in my book, that's too much of a coincidence.
But if the police were hoping Shipman would open up, they were about to be disappointed. He turned his back on his past and the detectives.
Can you please state your name and date of birth? I understand from your legal representative that no replies are going to be given to any questions throughout the course of this interview and any other future interviews.
Only one psychiatrist has formally assessed Harold Shipman. Dr. Richard Badcock has a unique insight into why he behaved so bizarrely.
It's an extreme way of trying to maintain control of a situation, but also control of yourself, isn't it? And if you haven't got any depth to your ways of dealing with things, you know, if you've lost your depth of coping, then these things, you know, appear instinctive, and they may be primitive, but they're very effective.
Shipman was saying nothing, but after examining medical records and death certificates, detectives knew exactly who he had treated and if he had been there when they died.
Just to try and jog your memory, Dr. Shipman, I have here a photograph of Lily Crossley, if you'd like to look at that. just for the benefit of the tape, Dr. Shipman's eyes are closed and he didn't look at the photograph at all. Can you remember Lily Crossley at all? Okay, no answer. If I can also, it's going to be awkward this keeping standing up and walking around, but I think this is what we're going to have to do. You might want to just sit back a little bit and then I don't keep pushing in front of you.
The detectives ploughed on.
We'll now move on to the next death which we've investigated. Dr. Shipman. This is in relation to the death of a lady called Elizabeth Pierce.
Again, Shipman refused to look at the image of a woman he had probably murdered.
That's Elizabeth Pierce. The three ladies there, it's the elderly lady dressed in black. For the benefit of the tape, Dr. Shipman's eyes are closed and he did not look at.
Shipman refused to cooperate throughout. The detectives stuck with it, but he could barely disguise his boredom.
Would you want to make any comment, Doctor? There's no comment.
West Yorkshire's investigation pointed to Shipman's involvement in at least 9 deaths in Todmorden. Although he admitted nothing, analysis of the medical records, death certificates and cremation papers provided substantial evidence. But because he was already facing the rest of his life behind bars, no further charges were laid against him.
And the time is 5 minutes past 5, and that's the end of the interview.
Shipman's Halifax interview ended like all the others, with no acknowledgement that he'd killed more than 250 people. Just a year later, he was to take his own life. But although he had admitted nothing, the police had gained one advantage. West Yorkshire's inquiry, with its reliance on the detailed analysis of old medical records, had broken new ground. If someone else in a position of trust began killing patients, the police could now always draw on the experience of investigating Britain's most notorious serial killer to stop it. And they didn't have to wait long. Just 18 months later, in 2002, the same police team were called to investigate Ethel Hall's death at Leeds General Infirmary. First, they looked at the staff who had been on duty on Ward 36 on the night the elderly patient collapsed. And their suspicions soon fell on a 26-year-old who had qualified as a male nurse less than 18 months earlier.
Can you give us your full name, please, Colin, and your date of birth?
Colin Campbell Norris, 12th of the 2nd, 76.
We're going to talk to you today, Colin, about you being arrested for the murder of Ethel Hall.
That's you, Colin, there. And this is your movements on the ward from the 19th, from when you've come on duty.
Looks like I did the most work.
Norris admitted he was the last to see Ethel Hall before she went into a coma. He also admitted being the last person to go into the fridge where the insulin was kept.
I've been on the scene all night because I've been at work since 8:45 the previous night.
Absolutely, but we've got you there. You, Colin, are the only person from records and on your own admission that are there at 4:30, half an hour before.
But Norris was confident that these facts alone proved nothing.
Obviously, if somebody was going to kill someone, they wouldn't leave their signature, would they?
What do you mean by that?
To say that they were there. I was doing my job.
You were doing your job?
Yeah.
But at the same time, you were also injecting a patient with insulin.
No, I wasn't. You're sitting there saying, you suspect, you presume, you blah, blah, blah.
Colin Norris grew up in Glasgow with his mother and stepfather and had worked as a travel agent after leaving college. But he told police he had always wanted to be a nurse, so after a few years, he decided to retrain.
Just being able to make a difference in people's lives. I know it sounds really silly,
No,
but
it doesn't.
you need to be a certain type of person to do it. I wasn't put on this earth to sit in an office.
Right.
He trained at Dundee University. His academic record was average, but his clashes with his tutor were memorable.
I'm not sure, and me didn't exactly see eye to eye. I had a personality clash, basically because I had one and she never, and she was my personal tutor.
After qualifying as a nurse, Colin Norris successfully applied for a job in Leeds. He liked the city, but as in Dundee, falling out with authority figures became a habit.
Even with more experienced staff and colleagues, he always felt he was the one who was right. Nobody could tell him anything. And if anyone in authority tried to tell him what to do or to challenge him in any way, he'd turn on them. And he was quite aggressive, you know, and he would be quite, you know, blunt by, you know, telling them where to stick the job almost.
Despite being close to his maternal grandmother, Norris admitted finding elderly patients challenging.
The smells.
The smells?
Mm-hmm. I couldn't get used to the smells. When I was bathing female patients, having to wash them down below, I found it difficult to start with. Especially if they were like ages with my gran, and they might have been a bit confused and they couldn't do it themselves. But I always had a female there anyway. You'd always have to have a needle on the end of it.
Dr. Richard Badcock was the forensic psychiatrist who assessed serial killer Harold Shipman. We asked him to look at Norris's interview tapes.
The clips of Mr. Norris's police interviews are quite interesting in the body language shown, because he does appear superficially confident and relaxed. And there's a lot of, you know, finger wagging, you know, what do you mean by this? And, but I'm saying, and, well, what do you expect?
It would have, if you say, like, somebody came and injected me with that, I would say to somebody, wait a minute, what are you doing? Even when you're giving patients their, like, morphine for through the night or whatever, when you inject them, they do make a noise, because, I mean, have you ever been injected with anything?
A lot of quite open body language, as it were, which is all designed to sort of impose his point of view or to project an air of authority.
I mean, I know exactly what you're saying.
So somebody would have noticed a noise from the patient, and or if the patient was asleep, they would have certainly woke up if somebody went and injected.
He actually was unwittingly helping us nail him at court eventually with his lies and what he thought was being smart and clever and arrogant. It all worked against him eventually.
Is there anything else you wish to say?
What about this?
About this?
No.
15 to conclude the interview.
By now, police knew that 2 other elderly women had died on Ward 36 after suddenly collapsing like Ethel Hall. And there was one common factor in all 3 cases.
The nurse who'd cared for each of them and was there in the couple of hours before each of them had become catastrophically ill was Colin Norris.
Ward 36 at Leeds General Infirmary, the place where detectives suspected that 3 people had been murdered, maybe more. All the victims had apparently been given a lethal dose of insulin, a substance normally used to save lives. Now police had to discover whether nurse Colin Norris had been using it as a murder weapon. Norris was the last person to see one victim, Ethel Hall, before she went into a coma. Statements from other staff on the ward showed he'd been behaving strangely in the hours leading up to her collapse. According to fellow nurse Ruth Sheehan, he'd even predicted Ethel's death.
He said, she just doesn't look right. And I said, like, why'd you say that? Like, and he just said, I have a feeling about her. I actually said, oh God, don't say that. Like, I'm very lucky. Nobody ever dies while I'm working, which is a common thing for nurses to say amongst each other. And he said, well, someone always dies when I do nights. And then he actually said a specific time, which I did think was a bit bizarre. He actually said, I predict 5:15 as being the time Ethel Hall will become unwell.
Immediately after Ethel's collapse, he made another strange comment.
He was at her side. He was like facing me. The patient was there in between us. He was there, I was here. He tapped his watch and he said, I think his words were, I told you. There was a clock on the wall behind him. I could see the time there. It was 5 a.m.
Can you remember making that comment?
I mean, yeah, because it's just like, when you're doing, I suppose you just get it in your job as well, you sort of obtain a black sense of humour. And it was probably said in a joking manner. If you knew me outside of this room, then you would know that I do have quite a dry sense of humour.
OK, you've got a dry sense of humour, but you've predicted 5:15.
Yeah, but I'm no Mystic Meg. I didn't know something was going to happen exactly, did I?
I think he was cocky. I think he was overconfident. He was showing off, predicting earlier on in the evening that a patient was going to go off, in his words, so accurately. Helped us with the presentation of the case to say this wasn't just a spontaneous incident where a criminal nurse at work had, for whatever reason, spontaneously decided to kill someone. He'd actually premeditated this hours before, that for whatever reason he was going to kill Ethel Hall with a massive overdose of insulin. And this was his undoing.
Well, I don't think for one moment he wanted to get caught. I think he just couldn't resist demonstrating a sense of superior knowledge. I don't think he thought it through. I mean, he was being careless, but I don't think he was being careless by intent. I think he just didn't think about it.
No, Colin.
No.
We've got prescriptions saying that...
I'm getting fed up.
Colin,
no, right.
3:15 in the morning.
The answer is don't answer any more questions, simply say no reply.
Police suspected Norris had injected at least 2 other elderly patients with lethal doses of insulin. But his consistent denials and lack of witnesses who'd seen him do it meant he was released on bail. Detectives then delved further into his background. They began examining every death on the 2 hospital wards where Norris had worked.
Records revealed there were 72 deaths on the 2 wards during the relevant time periods. We had to look at whether those 72 were suspicious or not, so we put in place a panel within the Trust of medical experts who looked through the various notes.
As in the Shipman inquiry, medical records held the key. The specialist medical panel recommended that patient notes relating to 18 of the 72 deaths should be reviewed by independent experts.
I came to the conclusion that 5 of the cases were due either to the injection of insulin or to the administration of drugs that make you secrete insulin. The police had exactly the same advice from the other 2 experts who'd looked through the files independently, and I think that gave the police confidence.
The experts confirmed that Ethel Hall, Bridget Burke and Doris Ludlam had all died from lethal injections of insulin. And they identified 2 more victims. Irene Crooks, a patient on another ward, had died from insulin poisoning, while Vera Wilby had survived an overdose, only to die of natural causes a year later. That was 4 cases of murder and 1 of attempted murder in less than 6 months, and they all shared one characteristic.
The common denominator across all 5 was one person, the nurse who'd cared for each of them and was there or thereabouts in the couple of hours before each of them had become catastrophically ill was Colin Norris.
But the police had to prove this was more than just coincidence. Over the next 2 years, they compiled more expert evidence. Each time they brought in Norris for questioning, he denied being involved. But on every occasion, he gave them fresh insights into his personality.
Colin Norris, to look at him, was quite a small, insignificant, really, I suppose, sort of slim fella. I found him quite a personable chap on some occasions to interview. He could be chatty, he could swap conversation with him, he was absolutely fine. And then, on the other hand, what I found very sinister about him was the fact that he couldn't remember these ladies, he had no empathy for them or their families, and the fact that he tried to sort of detach himself completely from any involvement with them, save to admit his entries in the patient notes, I found unbelievable, really.
But is there no one that can tell me, like your boss or anyone that can just tell me why I was arrested the first time?
Well, we're not going to get into a debate about that.
I'm not wanting a debate, I'm just wanting a straight answer.
Well, we're not going to go down this road.
Why not?
It's like, because I don't want to talk about this line of questioning.
But I want to talk about it.
We can talk
can you
about
get me
that.
your boss then?
We can talk about it at some future stage. When
what future stage? In another year and a half?
He did come across as very arrogant, very confident, and could be very, very aggressive in certain situations when he chose to be. There was one occasion when clearly he was becoming more and more agitated about our line of questioning because he wasn't answering the questions. He was trying to apportion blame to other nurses rather than answering the question he was being asked, and said, you know, I don't want to be interviewed anymore, and stood up and got very aggressive and had to be told to sit down and let's carry on with the interview.
Over the next few months, police carried out a painstaking analysis of staff rotas, phone records, and personnel files.
Who had access to the wards? Who had access to insulin? Who was on the wards at the time of each and every one of these incidents and deaths? And it was a slow process of investigation, elimination, and building the information until it presented the compelling picture that there was only one person left standing on each and every occasion. That was Colin Norris.
Meanwhile, a picture of Norris was emerging that was at odds with the popular caring nurse he liked to portray himself as. Some elderly patients, like Eric Garside, had experienced his cruel streak.
He's got his medals on for British Legion. He's very proud. And he loved the grandchildren. Dad was 87 years old when he had the fall. And he was very, very independent. He did everything, mostly everything for himself.
One evening, shortly after he'd been admitted to hospital, Eric Garside asked staff nurse Colin Norris for some help.
He asked him if he would empty his catheter bag, and Colin Norris point blankly refused and said, you're quite able to do that yourself. The bathroom is at the top end of the ward. With that, Colin Norris then went off duty and left my dad to it. And 10 minutes later, Dad had attempted to get out of bed and follow the instructions and had collapsed on the floor. He was very pale and thrashing his arms about, and so it was an ordeal for my dad. To think that, you know, these innocent elderly, mostly infirm patients were suffering at the hands of Colin Norris, it just makes me shiver.
Other elderly patients also described how Norris had treated them in an offhand and callous manner. Evidence of his apparent dislike of old people and his presence when each of the 5 victims was injected with insulin led police to interview him again. But his denials continued.
So the fact that I'm a nurse and I was in a hospital and someone died, that's the only thing that you've got?
When he kept telling me, is that all you've got? I kept saying to him, well, It's very, very damning that you are the only person on every occasion that's there within 2 hours. The suggestion that someone had come onto the ward during the night shift and gone onto a bay, injected a lady and snuck off there without anybody realising was just nonsense. It would mean that someone would be having to follow him round on each of these shifts to conduct these murders.
He had this arrogance and confidence that almost, you could see it at every turn. It wasn't a case of him more or less saying, I haven't done this. It was more a case of him saying, you will never prove this.
Well, I'm not going to admit to anything that I've not done, and I never murdered anybody, didn't inject anybody with anything. And I don't think your facts are good enough, I'm sorry.
But for detectives, those facts were good enough. After a 3-year inquiry, they finally believed there was sufficient evidence to charge him with 4 counts of murder and 1 of attempted murder. For Norris, the charges came as a shock.
He was so conceited all the time we were dealing with him, he never thought that it would get to that stage, I don't think.
Norris went on trial at Newcastle Crown Court in October 2007. After 5 years on bail, his normally calm exterior was starting to crack.
From his attitude when you watched him in court, and was stood up hammering on the windows at the judge, attacked some of the press when he came out of the court, it would appear he had a short temper. So don't know whether if somebody upset him, he would go off, in anger and do something. I don't know. But if he would attack people like the press outside when there's cameras about, what would he do on the ward?
Throughout the trial, Norris was confident he'd be acquitted. When the jury convicted him by 11-1, his reaction was one of disbelief.
Because we never had a witness saying they'd seen him coming out of one of the bays with a syringe in his hand, because we never had that evidence, and we had to work very, very hard to do the analytical work, to go through all the patient notes, to get the expert evidence all together. He never, ever in a million years thought that we would ever charge or convict him of this offence.
He thought, they haven't got that hard smoking gun piece of evidence that they need to convict me of these murders. What he didn't realise was that the evidence that was building in a circumstantial, compelling way that actually led to one conclusion and one conclusion only, that he had done it. And I think he was taken aback so much when the jury convicted him at the end of the day that it was the last thing he expected.
But questions remained. What made him do it? Was he motivated in the same way as Shipman? And would he have killed again? In March 2008, nurse Colin Norris was convicted of murdering 4 elderly patients and attempting to murder another. As no one had actually seen him deliver lethal injections of insulin as they slept, he thought he'd never be caught. But he was wrong.
He didn't see it as a suspect being seen with a smoking gun. But what we actually had was some hard evidence, which was a blood sample from a murder victim that was full of insulin, 1,000 units of insulin in that blood sample, which was just as good as, and that's what ultimately nailed him.
Like mass murderer Harold Shipman, who killed elderly patients with injections of morphine, Norris never showed any concern for his victims.
He never once said that he was sorry for what had happened to these ladies, never accepted that they'd been murdered, never had any compassion for the families at all, and was more concerned about how he'd been treated over the 2 years or 3 years of the investigation prior to our getting to a position where we could charge him.
You say I'm the common factor, so obviously you're blaming me for it. I'm the suspect. How did I do it? How am I supposed to have done it? Without anybody else noticing?
Neither Shipman nor Norris have ever admitted the guilt or responsibility for what they've done. And I think that reflects a similarity between both of them. There's an arrogance, there's a belief that they're both superior to what they've been convicted of and the criminal justice process they've gone through.
Would you want to make any comment, Doctor? No comment.
Shipman and Norris shared some characteristics. Both could be charming when they wanted to be, and both had a problem with authority. Shipman preferred to work alone in his own practice, while Norris frequently clashed with his bosses.
He had trouble with some supervisors because he had trouble with authority. He didn't like being told what to do. We know there was instances with his tutors where it was quite clear that he was manipulative. He'd been playing one tutor off against the other, and he'd got quite aggressive and nasty and sworn at people.
Neither Shipman nor Norris ever admitted to murdering their patients, and so we can only guess why they did it. But after watching both their police interviews, Dr. Richard Badcock believes that Norris was a psychopath who killed patients simply because they got in his way.
I don't think there's any indication that Mr. Norris's killings were done for deep-seated reasons, as they were. As it were, they seem to have been done more for casual, fairly immediate gratification. There's no indication that that there was any elaborate fantasizing associated with it, or that he was inducing hypoglycemia because he wanted to be seen as a hero coming to the rescue.
We know that some of the victims in our case were quite demanding. One of the ladies in particular could be aggressive on occasions. They were always falling out of bed, needed the beds changing, etc., etc. So that might be a reason why, if he's thought, well, you know, they take up too much of my time, that might be a motive for him to kill them. Who knows?
What the motivation is, only Colin Norris would know. But I think it's something as simple as he found elderly patients irritating. We know he didn't like the placements in the geriatric units and the wards, and so something simple like just throwing bed covers off was enough to set him going.
But whatever his motivation, Norris's actions had a profound effect on his victims' families.
After Mum was attacked, my father's health deteriorated through the stress of the situation. He had another heart attack, and he needs support now. He's a dangerous person that knows how to murder, but make it very difficult to prove. I think he needs to be kept inside.
Norris killed 4 patients and tried to kill a 5th in his first year of working as a nurse. If he'd continued at that rate throughout his career, he could have been as big a serial killer as Harold Shipman.
I'm convinced that if Colin Norris hadn't have been stopped in his tracks, then he would have developed into being a serial killer of immense proportions. Within 6 months, he'd killed 4 and attempted to kill another elderly patient. He was becoming so confident and skilled in his own mind, in his killing craft, that he thought he could kill with impunity, and he was doing. He was killing in an environment where he was confident, he had the opportunity, he was dealing with vulnerable elderly patients who were confused. And he was using all these things to do what he enjoyed doing, because I'm convinced he enjoyed killing people.
I think it's likely that Mr. Norris would have gone on killing. I don't know how many further deaths there would have actually been, because his approach to it was sort of casual. Because the patients were annoying him, or because he was feeling irritated, or he felt they were impinging on his life in an unfair way.
To secure a conviction against Colin Norris, tens of thousands of documents had to be examined. Only when the information they contained was systematically analysed did police uncover the evidence they needed. That work stopped Norris when the number of his victims was still in single figures, unlike the scores attacked by Harold Shipman. But when people place their lives in the hands of medical professionals, can we ever really prevent a rogue doctor or nurse hurting those they're supposed to be caring for?
Unfortunately, there are criminals that work in lots of trusted organisations, and the medical profession is no exception to that. So whilst we stopped Colin Norris in his tracks, Shipman wasn't stopped in his tracks. Could it happen again? Possibly could.
8 years after Shipman was jailed, Colin Norris's conviction had dealt the medical profession another shattering blow. And apart from the relatives of his victims, no one was more outraged than those who'd worked alongside him.
Very sad that patients died in our care, because I have a sense that we failed those patients. I personally apologise to the family. He used the position in which he was in, he used that position of trust to kill people. I can't conceive of a worse crime.
The emergency services are highlighted and followed. Steve Scott's back with Night Watch next.